as you may have noticed, I'm going to be showing you my technique for painting still life. And still life is one of those things I like to paint because as an artist, sometimes it's hard to come up with ideas for what to paint. So eventually what I found that worked the best was to go on a random word generator on the internet and just generate random words, like mushroom or tree, fox, different things. And that way you always have an idea to draw. And as I started to get more and more into that, I started to realize that this process of going through and finding an image and trying to pick it apart and break it down into its fundamental pieces and then draw it is a really good practice overall just for learning how to draw and becoming a better painter overall. So I'm going to show you how to do that. If you want to follow along, hopefully you've installed my custom workspace. If not, don't stress because all the brushes I'm using are just going to be standard brushes that come with Painter. So what we're going to do first is we're going to take a look over here in the layers palette, and I've gone ahead and created some layers ahead of time just to save a little time here, and I've grouped them together. What I've done is I've gone ahead and I've looked at my reference photo, and I'm thinking about what layers overlap other layers. So you can see this cap is kind of one big general shape, and then the veil, which is underneath the cap, is one general shape, and then the stem is a general shape, and then you have the little warts that are on the cap here. So if you can break things down ahead of time mentally and go ahead and create your layers, if you know what they're going to be, that makes things a lot easier later because then you can look over here and you can go, okay, I want to work on the cap, I'll go to the cap layer. If you just have one single layer, or you just have layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, layer 4 without any naming, it's going to be too hard to keep track of them. So what I've done is I've gone ahead and loaded my reference image. I'm going to go to the sketch layer, and I'm going to select a dark gray color. I'm going to use the Detail Oils brush, which is found in the Oils category. And I'm going to use a keyboard shortcut to resize my brush. I'm going to hold down Control and Alt and drag my pen, or Command Option on the Mac. And that'll help me size my brush on the fly. So we want something kind of nice and thin. I'm also going to zoom in so we can all see this a little bit better. And I'm going to turn on mirror painting mode by clicking here. Now, be careful not to move this line left or right or twist it, so just kind of stay away from it. We'll switch back to the brush tool, and now when we sketch on one side, we get the same result on the other mirrored. So we'll go ahead and plot out our mushroom now. Let's say we want our cap to be here. You'll see I'm not trying to draw a continuous line because I have a really wobbly hand, and that never works out too well for me. So I just kind of scrub back and forth and sketch and kind of build up the line. It doesn't have to be a perfectly smooth line. This is just going to be an indicator of what we want here. So we'll have the part that they call the veil that comes down there, and then we'll have the stem. So we'll zoom out a little bit.
Aaron?
And yes?
I hate to interrupt. I just want to make sure. I have a couple people saying that they cannot hear the audio. I'm hearing you just fine. I just wanted to make sure, everybody, if you are having an issue right now, let me know. Okay, so it appears it's an issue just for some people. So for those of you that may be having audio issues, I recommend if you have the capability, call the landline. There is a telephone number that GoToWebinar provided for you that you can dial in. Okay, sorry to interrupt, Aaron. Looks like we're good.
All right. Yeah, we want everybody to be able to hear what's going on, otherwise it'll be very hard to follow. So we'll go back to the Detail Oils brush. So I have the basic idea of the sketch. I'm not going to worry about drawing on all the warts and that stuff. And next what I want to do is I want to go ahead and just fill in each of these layers with a flat color. It doesn't even have to be the final color that I use. So for instance, let's go to the cap layer. Let's pick just a bright blue, something that we can easily see on this white background. The reason why is because if you were to use, maybe you're painting on a darker background or something, if you're using a darker color to fill in your fill here, you wouldn't really be able to see it, and same goes with light. You know, if I was using yellow, that might be really hard to see on this white background. Blue is really easy to see. We won't worry about the edges being sloppy because we can clean those up really easily. Let's go to the veil layer. Let's just use a bright red for that. guess we could have used a bright red for the cap too, but oh well. Let's go to the stem layer. We'll pick green. We'll just paint that in. I'm using the Scratchboard tool here. This is found under the pen and ink category, I believe. So we have our basic layers. Now we can go ahead and dim the opacity of this sketch a little bit by selecting the sketch layer and reducing the opacity down so that you can just kind of see a little bit of the sketch and a little bit of the layers underneath. We'll go to the cap layer first, and we're going to want to clean up this edge. There's a couple of ways you could do it. You could, of course, take the Scratchboard and try to paint it nice and smooth, and that would probably take you forever to do. Or you could use your eraser, but there's an easier way to do this. If you look under the distortion brushes, which I believe are under effects, you can get to pinch. And what pinch does, if you paint with it in one place with firm pressure and you start to kind of pull away from that point, it works kind of like a vacuum or like a black hole. It's kind of pulling the pixels towards its center. So if you paint along the edge of this mushroom here, it's going to kind of squish those pixels together, kind of like when you close like a plastic bag with a little zipper on it that closes it. You kind of squeeze it together and it pinches together and it kind of compresses it. So I'm just painting back and forth along this line to smooth it out, and you can kind of pull away from the line or pull towards the line to reshape it. So we want it to be kind of flat on bottom, and when we get something like that, we're looking pretty good. Now we'll go to the stem layer and let's smooth that out. I'm using kind of really long, smooth brush strokes here and just going back and forth along that line. Once it's smooth, then we're looking pretty good. Now, we don't really need this sketch anymore, so we can either click the eyeball to turn it off, or you could delete the sketch, but we'll just hide it here in case we need it later. And let's do some work on the veil. So if you need to smooth out the veil with the pinch brush, you can do that. You can also try the Distorto brush, and that kind of pushes and pulls pixels. So we could push that up, push up the bottom of the veil here, use a thinner brush to create some little dents. Now, you may or may not want this to be perfectly symmetrical. I don't want it to be perfectly symmetrical. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and turn off mirror painting mode. So I'm going to click on the mirror painting mode icon and then click this off button. Now that's turned off. So now, if we continue doing what we were doing, pushing these pixels around, we can make it a little more varied. Let's say something like that. And if you do have any questions along the way about what I'm doing, feel free to enter them in the dialog box there, and we'll be happy to answer them. I'm going to go to the cap layer, and I'm going to turn on Preserve Transparency. Now, Preserve Transparency is really handy because what it does is it will allow you to confine your paint within the painted area that's on that layer. So basically what's on this cap layer is just the cap, and if I try to paint anywhere outside of the cap on this checkered area, which represents nothing or full transparency, I can't paint. But as I start to move towards the cap, you can see that my paint is kind of locked inside this non-transparent area, so the transparency is being preserved or locked. So with that on, I could then pick a color, maybe like the darker red from my reference image here. And I can choose Fill. And you can also go to Edit Fill, but I have a little shortcut for it here. So if I fill, my paint stays within that shape. That's perfect. Then I'll go to the veil layer, and we want this color here. Now, picking colors, it might seem kind of tricky at first, but the way I like to do it is I like to break it down into a few steps. The first is I think about what's the hue of this color, and I'm thinking about the general kind of cream or tan color here. These brown kind of tannish colors are usually somewhere between red and yellow, so I'm going to just pick orange just to start out. Then I'm going to think about how dark or how light is that color. And on your color picker, that's this axis here, this vertical axis. So let's guess, and let's say it's pretty light. Then I'm going to think about how saturated is the color. Is it kind of a pastel, kind of gray color? or is it a really bright, vibrant color? And I think it's more towards pastel, so I'm going to stick around here. I'm going to choose fill, and I think that color works for me. I'm going to go to the stem layer, and I'm going to make that color slightly different, slightly darker. That way I can see these two layers against each other, like so. And then let's give the background just a little bit of color. Let's pick a kind of light gray color like this. We'll choose fill, and there you go. We have our basic layering done. So now what we'll do is we'll go ahead and we'll start adding some really basic shading. And I like to work from kind of broad to specific. So I get the broad general shape first, I refine the shape, I give it its basic color, and then I'll start to add some three-dimensional shading to add form. And form is like the 3D contour. So let's start with the cap, and let's go ahead and hold Alt on our keyboard and click on this red color to sample it. And we want a brighter color, so we're going to go into our color picker here, and we're going to shift the hue a little bit more towards orange or yellow. I always shift the hue when I'm picking my color. Sometimes I shift it warmer, sometimes I shift it cooler. In this case, I'm going to shift it a little bit warmer because this is going to be a highlight. I'm going to pick a lighter and more saturated red, like so, by going up and to the right in my color picker. And I'm going to choose the Airbrush. The Airbrush is one of my favorite brushes. That's why it's first on the list here, because this brush naturally creates these nice transitions in color that are known as gradients. So if you paint with a really large brush, you can see it creates that lighter to darker transition. Now that saves me the time of having to pick each of those colors, paint them in, and then blend them. So I'm going to vary my brush size here, but basically we want our light to be coming from the top left. So the top left area of this cap is what we're going to lighten. And this is kind of like a sphere that's cut in half almost, so you want to think of it that way when you're shading it. I'm going to use a smaller brush, and I'm going to paint with the edge of the brush to create a rim highlight. Now if I zoom in, you'll see what that's doing is that's just kind of, it's giving the appearance of the light kind of curving around that edge there. It makes it look curved instead of flat, basically. I'm going to lighten my color even brighter. I'm just going to go towards the end of this color picker here, and I'm going to shift warmer again in my hue. And I'm going to put in a little more highlight here. You can start to make it kind of spotty if you want to imply some texture. I'm going to go even brighter, shift it again. And then I need to start moving towards white, so I'm going to shift the hue again towards orange. And you want to kind of keep the light colors inside of the last lightest color that you use. So you'll notice I'm not putting any of this light color over here in the dark area. I'm keeping it concentrated in the center.
Aaron,
The center of the highlight. Yes?
we have a question asking, and I'm throwing this out to you so that everyone can benefit. What are the
Sure.
keyboard strokes for changing the brush size on the fly?
Yeah, so that is you hold Control and Alt, and then you tap your pen down and you drag. And on Mac, that is Command and Option, I believe, and tap and drag your pen.
Yes.
And see how that resizes it? Now that is the absolute, if that's the only thing you take away from this webinar, that's going to save you a ton of time because, you know, going up here and changing your brush size is not always the most efficient way to do it. You can also use the bracket keys on your keyboard. Those are the ones that look like that, and those will make your brush bigger and smaller in increments. So if you're having trouble drawing this little tiny brush, just go ahead and use the bracket keys to make it a nice tiny brush. But yes, this is a wonderful shortcut. Yours may look green, don't worry about that. I didn't really like the green color, so in your edit preferences, I believe it's under interface. Nope, it's under general. Yeah, if you want it without the green, you can check this little box here. Okay, so we have a little bit of a highlight. Let's make that a little bit brighter. Let's go all the way to white. And let's add some white area here. a lot of this is going to get covered up by the warts, so don't worry about it too much. The wonderful thing is that since we have all this in layers, if we mess something up, we can always go back and just change that one layer. You don't have to start over or, paint in some of the background and then start over in that way either. So let's go ahead and add in some of those warts. So anytime that you want to paint on a new layer or a layer that has nothing on it, you have to make sure that preserve transparency is not on, because since it's preserving or locking the transparency, if I try to paint right now on this warts layer which has nothing on it, nothing's going to happen. If I turn off preserve transparency, I can do whatever I want. So as a rule of thumb, when you're done with preserve transparency, go ahead and turn that off. So on the warts layer, we'll go ahead and use the Scratchboard tool. Now mine says smooth Scratchboard. That's just because I changed it a tiny bit, but the regular Scratchboard will work just fine as well. We can go ahead and select kind of a basically white cream color, kind of a similar color to what we had for the stem here, but maybe just a bit brighter. And I'm going to zoom in to the cap. And what I want to do is I want to kind of just tap with this brush, and sometimes it's going to make perfect spheres and sometimes it's going to make ones that have little breaks, but that's okay because that's kind of the natural shape that these take. Maybe we'll just go ahead and use white so that we can see these better, because we can change the color later. I'm having trouble seeing it on that other white there. So what I want to do here is, because this is going to take quite a while to add in all these dots and things, I'm just going to show you how to do a few, and then I'm going to jump ahead to basically the same painting but with all these little warts drawn in, and that will give you some time to ask me some questions, and then people who are following along can also catch up. So if there are any questions,
yes,
feel free to send them my way.
Okay, so I'm just going to scroll up here. So similar to the brush resize, is there a quick key for the zoom and or another tool that you could use?
The M key enables the zoom tool. You could also use the navigator in the window menu. There's the navigator that has some zoom things here where you can zoom in and out like so. If you're using a tablet that has express keys like the Wacom Intuos Pro, that has a little has a couple little buttons on it that you could set to zoom. I'm using the Cintiq 24 HD, which has a little wheel that I can zoom in and out with. I'm using that right now.
Yeah, I think that's the most handy one, especially, if you're using your tablet.
Yeah, and then I'm also using spacebar. If you hold spacebar, you can pan your page. That's really helpful. And then I use tab to hide my palettes, so then I can, I can actually see my painting on the whole screen, basically. So tab and spacebar, and then that little shortcut for resizing your pen. Those are all really handy.
Okay, and Lori, thanks for answering that and giving us multiple options. Lori was wondering, you were using a blending tool and she couldn't find it in your workspace. I don't know if you could point out which one you were using.
Yeah, the blending tool, I wonder if it was one of the distortion ones. I was using pinch to kind of smooth out the edges.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was using Distorto, which was kind of smudging stuff around. It's here in Effects. I think in Painter 12 it might be in a different category called Distortion, if I'm not incorrect there. But I think in X3 in 2015 it's in the FX category.
Okay, so I'll see. I'll make sure that answered her question.
Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, this is a good one too. We noticed that you didn't have undo on your shortcuts bar. Is it easy to add that?
Yeah, I use Control-Z for undo.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of the reason why I don't have it on there. Really what's on here is kind of what I use most often that isn't already a keyboard shortcut or something that I can get to really easily. With the exception of like new and save and cut and copy and paste. Some of these are kind of here just to help other people find them. Like when I'm doing a tutorial that I'm recording for YouTube, it makes more sense to point up here and say go to cut rather than have to make an annotation or go through the menu and all that. So
yeah, and you could also add that to your Wacom tablet, one of the buttons on there too. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So I see I opened the wrong file here. Let's see if I can get to the right one. Oops, opening it in the wrong program. Okay, well, got my steps out of order. That figures. So what we'll do is I'm just going to really quickly add in a few warts, and my mushroom is just going to be really warty on one side and not so much on the other. But you know what? Sometimes they're like that in real life. So you want there to be a variety of big and small, have them kind of clump together. You wouldn't want to make it look like a polka dot unless that's the style you're going for. So what I want to do for my warts is I want to create some shadows for them because they're sticking up. They're not really spots like decorations on the cap. They're actual little clumps that stick up. I don't want to get into the whole, anatomy of a mushroom, but when this thing forms, these are little pieces that remain of the little veil that covers it. So what we want to do is we want to right-click on the warts layer. We want to choose Duplicate Layer. I believe on the Mac you hold down Command, I think, and you click, and that gives you the right click. So on that lower warts layer, the one that's underneath, let's call that warts shadow. Let's turn on Preserve Transparency because we're going to want to change the color of this shadow. And let's pick like a dark red so it matches our piece. Let's choose Fill. And then we'll select the Move tool, which is this black arrow. And if you hit the arrow keys on your keyboard, you can nudge this around in very small increments. So I'm going to nudge it away from the light source to the right, and then down a little bit. And we'll get these nice shadows. Now, some of these shadows are going off of the mushroom, and we can't have that because that doesn't look right. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn off Preserve Transparency, and we're going to select the eraser. I hardly ever use the eraser because I like to work forwards and not backwards, so this is one of the few times I'll actually use the eraser. So we have our shadows now. Let's go ahead and use that same dark color, and we'll select the Airbrush. And I want to extend some of these shadows a little bit because maybe these warts that are kind of more in the center are sticking up further than the ones that are curving around the corners. So their shadow will be a little bit longer. And then maybe if you have some that are really densely clumped together, you can give them more of a shadow too. Try to avoid putting any shadow in this, too much shadow in this lighter area. On that wart shadow layer, I'm going to turn on Preserve Transparency again. I'm going to select white. Now, I want to change the composite method of this layer to multiply. The composite method controls how one layer blends with the layers that are underneath it. So for instance, you might want a layer to blend darker and tint the layer, kind of like a marker or a watercolor would, or you might want the layer to just cover it up like oil paint would, or maybe you'd want it to be lighter. So we want this to be darker. We're going to select multiply. Now, since multiply multiplies the dark values and makes things darker, if we select something like white and we paint, that's basically going to have the effect of erasing that shadow, which we want to do mainly on the lighter part of the mushroom. So now we have these shadows that are really dark and intense on the far side, and then over here they're a little bit lighter. Zooming out to evaluate your piece is always good because often when you're looking at some of these objects like a mushroom, it's a pretty small object, so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to view it too large. So let's go ahead and add some more shading to this. We'll select the airbrush. Let's go to the cap layer, and we'll hold Alt to sample this dark red color. Let's make it a little bit darker. We'll shift it a little bit towards a magenta, Give it a little more darkness. Now, most things that are at least semi-reflective are going to reflect their environment color. Now, if it's a object that's out in like a daylight sky, that environment color is probably going to be the color of the sky, which would be a light blue. In this case, we're using a gray background, so that's going to be my environment color. So I'm going to hold Alt to sample that gray background color. And I'm just going to paint in a little bit of that. Maybe that was too much. I'm going to do a couple undos here. I don't want to be too strong with it. If you paint too much, you can always select that dark color that you were using. Put that back in. So I think that looks pretty good for the shading on the cap. Let's go to the veil layer and let's add some shading. I'm going to hold Alt to sample that tan color. I want to make it a little bit darker. Shift the hue a little bit more towards red. Now we're going to have a lot of shadow being cast from the cap, so we want to put that in. And then the veil and the stem are kind of just cylinders, more or less. So we want to shade them appropriately. We'll go to the stem layer, and we'll just give it a dark side and a light side. I might paint with the edge of the brush here, just along the other side. That helps it look more curved. The trick with some of these shapes is to getting them to not look flat, and a lot of that is adding these little transitions along the edges. Let's select a light color, shift it back towards yellow, add in some of that. So generally my highlights are warmer when I shift the hue, and my shadows are cooler when I shift the hue. We'll go back to the veil. I'm just picking a cooler, darker brown color. And I'm just going to go along the bottom edge. What I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to give this form, make it stand out and look curved rather than flat. Go to the stem. I need some shadow. You'll notice I'm kind of keeping the same color here and going back and forth between these layers. If I don't do that, then there's going to be some inconsistency in my color unless I were to save color swatches or something. So I'm doing this just for convenience so that I make sure that I have the exact same browns on the stem as I do on the veil. See how adding that little bit of shadow underneath makes the underside look curved? And maybe we'll go a little bit darker, a little bit cooler to add some more shadow. Okay, let's go to a lighter color. The shadows kind of set things back, push them in, and make them look kind of sunken in, and the highlights kind of push things out towards you. Go to the stem, add a highlight to that. Maybe we'll select white. That'll really stand out now. So now we want to do a little bit of detail with the detail oils. This will just give us some little fine highlights that are a little bit sharper. So as I mentioned before, I work from broad to fine, or from broad to specific. So I kind of start out with these big blocky transitions in color, and then I go through with a smaller brush and add in the little sharp highlights and things. I'm going to sample that darker color and use that to separate some of this veil here. Go back to the stem. I want to sample one of these kind of medium tan colors. And I'm going to draw some little jagged lines that run vertically down the stem. When they get towards the bottom, you want them to kind of curve in. That helps imply that that's a curved surface there. Let's do the same thing with the lighter color. Put that lighter color right up against those dark lines. That'll make it look like little creases. And then now we can go ahead and we can blend this. So we have a couple different options for blending. The two that I'm going to use here are going to be Diffuse Blur and Coarse Oily Blender. So we'll start with Coarse Oily Blender. The Coarse Oily Blender works along with your opacity, your grain, and the paper texture that you have selected. If you're not seeing the papers palette, it's under the window menu, paper panels, papers. Now there's a lot of different papers you can choose from. These are going to give you some texture that your brush will be able to utilize while you're blending. So I'm going to use the organismal texture called Polypay Wool. Now this is an add-on brush that you can get from Corel. If you don't have this brush, then you can probably use something like Simulated Wood Grain or Pebbleboard, or just experiment here. I'm going to use this one here, and then I'm going to just go ahead and blend and see what I get. Now what this is doing is while I'm blending, it's also giving me this texture. Let's try a different brush. Let's try basic paper. If you play with these settings too, this controls the scale of the texture, and this one controls the contrast. So let's turn the scale and contrast up. That gives us a nice texture and adds more detail just from blending. Let's go to the veil layer, and we'll blend that as well. Now you want there to be a balance between coarse and soft texture here, so we don't want it all to be really sharp, so we'll select the Diffuse Blur. The Diffuse Blur kind of has two strengths. If you press down really firmly with this brush, you're going to really blend away any detail and soften, which you may want to do sometimes, and other times you may want to press really lightly with it and just ever so slightly blur it a little bit. So in this case I'm going to do that. I'm very lightly going to blend. That way I don't destroy that texture. I just soften it in a few places here and there. I need to go to the stem layer if I want to blend the stem. Even for somebody who's done so many paintings, I still forget things now and then, like I might accidentally leave preserve transparency on, or I might try to paint on a layer that's not selected, or I might have a selection active that's hidden that I don't know is there. Those things are things that are easy to forget for anybody, no matter how experienced you are, so don't feel bad if you find yourself losing track of layers or getting confused. With practice, you'll know exactly what's wrong as soon as it happens. You'll go, hey, I'm trying to paint on the stem, why is nothing happening? And then eventually you'll look over and go, oh, I was on the wrong layer. So, once you know the solutions, you can get unstuck a lot easier.
Aaron, about preserve transparency, there was a question, and I don't know off the top of my head, is there a shortcut to turn preserve transparency on and off?
I don't know.
Okay, so we can I'll look into that one after this.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah. A lot of people, people are asking if we have created a shortcut document. And I did create one, I think it was for version X3 that's available on painterartist.com. If you go to Learning, you will see when you get on the page there's a shortcuts document, but we're also trying to work on a kind of a quick guide, a guide at a glance for the shortcuts. So I hope to have that within the next few weeks for everybody.
Yeah. Well, that sounds cool. I think what's important about preserve transparency is that you're aware when it's on and off, and a keyboard shortcut could be handy, but I think having it here visually also kind of helps you know when you've turned it on, and you can look and you can see if it's blue it's on, if it's black it's off. So personally I think I like to have that visual feedback there, and that way if I'm painting I don't have some invisible force that's stopping me from painting. I can look over here and go, oh, that's what it is. So you may, even if there is a keyboard shortcut, you still may want to keep really good track of whether or not that's on or off. So let's zoom in and let's add a little bit of shading to our warts, because our warts aren't flat spots. They have some three-dimensional form as well. So we'll go to the warts layer. Preserve transparency can be on here. And let's sample the colors from our stem here. Let's get one of these lighter colors. I'm going to use the Scratchboard tool for this. And each of these warts is going to have kind of a shadow side and a highlight side. So Go ahead and draw in some of these shadows. If there are any other questions, feel free to shoot them my way. I can answer them because this is another spot where I can kind of skip ahead if I need to.
So
just putting in.
Mary is saying, Aaron said that we could get more papers from Corel when he was putting texture on the stem. How do we do that?
Yeah, so that was in a Corel Painter 12 add-on that came out a while ago. I think it's still up, if I'm not mistaken. Probably the fastest way to if the page is still up, you could do a Google search for, I think it was Corel Painter additional content library. Probably the fastest way to do it would be to install my workspace because it's included in that. And then you could probably export that paper out of my workspace and then import it back into your own if that's easier for you.
And I can follow up with this one too because we did use to provide additional content on the website. I'm just not, I can't remember if we did that for 2015, but I can probably dig some stuff up for those of you that are interested. So if you are interested, just send me an email. You all have my email from the webinar registration. All the questions were coming to me. So let me know if you'd like some extra papers and I can get those over to everybody.
Yeah, those extra papers are cool. They make a huge difference. I'm going to make sure that each of these have a highlight because there's a few of these that I put in with that darker color at first and they look kind of flat. So you can see I kind of built each of these up. And I'll go ahead and sample a darker color and add a little bit more dark on a couple of these, but not too much. They're mostly light.
So there's a question. Meralda was wondering, and this may be hard to answer, why are you using the Scratchboard tool for the warts on the mushroom?
The reason why is because this Scratchboard tool, get that out of here. The Scratchboard tool, if I create, well, let's just do it on the warts layer. When you tap with it, you get this weird broken edge because what this tool is it's a kind of a flat line, more or less, the shape of the brush. So it also, I think it kind of twirls and makes a circle at the same time. So you get these weird random shapes. You don't get the same shape every time. And when you look at these warts up close on a photograph of a mushroom, these aren't really like little spherical nodules or anything. There's actually something that covers the mushroom, and then this kind of breaks out of that, and these are like little pieces of skin that are kind of left there. So they're irregular shapes. They're mostly spherical. And when you look at a mushroom from a normal distance, they appear to be spherical, but when you look at them up close, they're not. So whether or not that's, detail that you need to add, that's kind of up to you. But I think it gives it, a more random effect. And for me, painting digitally, I don't necessarily like there to be a digital or an traditional look. I like it to be kind of ambiguous so that you can look at it and go, is that a colored pencil drawing, or is that a painting, or is that digital, So having this randomness and this variety kind of helps that. If I just use the same little, I could go in here and use like a selection tool and make little selections everywhere, but then I'm going to have these perfect spheres everywhere, and when you look at that, it's going to look kind of artificial. So just a way to get more detail in there. If you're wondering also, just while we're on the topic of the Scratchboard tool, this is what I thought you were going to ask, why I'm using it to fill in these flat colors instead of something like the Airbrush. The reason why is because the Scratchboard tool is one of the brushes that's fully opaque if you set the opacity to 100%, and no matter what kind of pressure you use, you're always going to get an opaque line. I don't want there to be any see-through in these layers because, for instance, if I had filled in this cap with the Airbrush or something, you might be able to see through to the layer underneath, which would be the veil, and that wouldn't be good. So generally, I keep this Scratchboard tool always set to 100%. It also has a very nice smooth edge, whereas some of the other ones don't because they're simulating natural media and shouldn't have a straight edge. So That just saves me time of having to smooth it out. So let's see. On here, what we can do is we can go ahead and start adding a little bit of shading to these warts overall, because each wart has its own highlight and its own shadow because it's its own little three-dimensional shape. But as a whole, these warts they kind of make up this cap shape too. So they should be darker on this far side and lighter on this highlight side. So to do this, rather than go through and paint over this layer, what we're going to do is we're going to make a selection of these warts, and then we're going to create a new layer and we're going to paint on that layer. So on the warts layer, we're going to choose Select Layer Content. You can also right-click on the layer to get Select Layer Content. That puts a selection around those warts, as you can see. Now if we create a new layer, that selection goes with us to that new layer. So we could call this layer Warts Tinting. Let's change the composite method to multiply because we want this to kind of get darker and tint what's underneath. And then just so we don't have to see these little marching ant lines, let's do Show Hide Selection, or you can do Control-Shift-H on your keyboard to hide that selection. The selection's still active, but you just don't see the lines. And this works very similar to Preserve Transparency, where now when we paint, we can only paint inside the selection. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to take maybe a dark blue-gray like this. We'll paint over these warts that are on the far side and on the bottom side. And then we'll select white, and we'll use a smaller airbrush. I was using the airbrush for that to do that shading. I'm just going to airbrush out with white on the highlight side of those warts just to make sure that they still look three-dimensional. Like so. And then while we still have that selection active, actually let's do this. Let's go ahead and add some shading the same way, but let's do that to the whole mushroom. Now of course you could go and you could create a new layer and a new selection for each piece of that layer, but there is a handy feature in Corel Painter 2015. I'm not entirely sure if you can do this in the older versions or not, but there is Select Group Content. That puts a selection around a group of layers. These layers I grouped together with Control-G. So if you don't have Select Group Content, then, as I mentioned before, you'd have to add selections and layers for each of those layers. But what we'll do here is we will add a new layer, and let's call this Shading Over. Since this is going to be a shadow, most of the time my shadows are set to multiply for the composite method. Pick that same kind of dark blue color, use the airbrush again, and now when we paint, we're painting on a layer that has a selection keeping the paint inside this entire mushroom shape. So that's how we get our shading overall. Let's create a new layer. Let's call this Overlay. This is going to be a color overlay. We'll set the composite method to overlay. What this is going to do is this is just going to change up the flavor of the mushroom a little bit. Let's select an orange. We'll paint with airbrush on the highlight side. And we'll select a blue, and we'll paint with a blue on the shadow side. Now, we don't need this selection anymore, so we can do Select None or Control-D. And that's a little bit too strong for the overlay, so we're going to reduce the opacity until it's very subtly warmer on one side and cooler on the other. Go to the Shading Overlayer. Let's reduce that. And let's just delete that sketch layer. We don't need that anymore. For some reason, that's showing up there still, but that's okay. Maybe I did something weird on my end. So what we will do is we'll go ahead and flatten all these layers now, because at this point I don't really need my layers anymore, and eventually what you're going to end up with is one layer anyways when you save your image for printing or for posting on the web. So what I like to do is I like to save iterations. I don't use the automatic iterative save feature. What I do is I just go to Save As, before I do something like flattening layers or doing any major change, or even if it's at a point where I want to try something experimentally but I don't know if it's something I want to keep. I'll save a copy. I'll save mushroom 1, mushroom 2, mushroom 3, and so on. I'm going to save as a riff. Make sure that Adobe RGB is checked here because I'm using the Adobe RGB color profile, but if you're not, don't worry about that. So I have a copy saved. That way, when I choose drop all layers, which will flatten all my layers, then I will get something like so, and I'll do save as again. That way I have one copy with layers and one copy without. Now, I did something weird here. You probably aren't going to have this little mess, but you know what? It's nice to see somebody make a mistake. That way you can see how to fix it. So in this case, it's actually pretty easy. I could have gone through and figured out what layer this stuff was on and erased it ahead of time. But what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to sample that background color and just paint over whatever this is here. This looks like part of the sketch. It's not the end of the world. There's a little bit up there too. Okay, so we fixed that. Now, let's use the Diffuse Blur blender to blur out the bottom of the mushroom. Of course, you don't have to do that, but I think it looks cool. And then let's select the Blur blender. It's in the Blenders category. You may want to set your opacity a little bit higher. I have mine set at 60. I'm going to blur along the edges here, because these edges that are curving away from you in three-dimensional space should get kind of hazier since your eye can't really focus on them as well. This is also kind of one of those steps that helps your art look less digital. And in my style, kind of what I'm going for is a photographic look. I'm not necessarily going for realism per se because I want it to look realistic, but I also want to change it and I want to make it my own. So anywhere where I determine I want to make the colors brighter, or I want to change the shape, or change the size, or anything, I'm going to do that. I don't always follow my photo. And you can see here, of course, I messed up my steps and got them out of order and didn't do the warts exactly how I wanted to, but nevertheless, I got the same basic composition, but this is a unique mushroom. It's not identical to the reference photo. So one more thing that we'll do, because I know we're starting to run out of time here. Let's add a layer of texture, because even if you flatten your layers, it's not too late to add more layers for things. Let's make that texture layer a multiply composite method, and let's use the square chalk brush. This is found in chalk and crayons. Let's use that organismal polypay wool texture. You can also try some other paper textures. I've also inverted it. You'll have to click this invert button here. Forgot to mention that earlier. I'm going to select a tan color. I'm going to paint in some texture here. So we'll just keep it on the stem. I'm going to increase the paper scale each time. And I get this nice wrinkled texture. Now I'm going to right-click on that layer and I'm going to duplicate it. Let's call one of these texture light. I'm going to set this to screen. Screen is the opposite of multiply. It makes the layers underneath lighter. I'm going to select a light cream color, and I'm going to fill that. Oops, I need to turn on preserve transparency first, and then fill it. That way the paint will stay within there. And I'm going to select the move tool, and I'm going to nudge this light layer towards the light source. See how that adds a really cool elevated texture there? Zoom in on that. So then I'm going to go ahead and just reduce the opacity of these layers so that they aren't so dark, like so. I'm going to choose drop all layers again to flatten the layers, and I'm going to blend it with a diffuse blur very lightly so that I don't destroy all that texture, but I just blend it in a little bit. And then let's add a new layer for Vignette. This will just be some lighting in the background. We'll set this to multiply for the composite method. Choose a light blue-gray and the digital airbrush. I'm just going to lighten the side of the composition that's facing away from the light, like so. Reduce the opacity of that layer. We'll create another new layer. We'll call this light. Let's set this to screen, and we'll select white. We'll do the same thing, but on the light side. And we'll have the light overlap the cap just a little bit, like so. You can reduce the opacity of that too if you need to. And then let's drop all layers. Let's add one last little focus effect to this. So what we want to do is we want to choose Select All. So you go to Select All. We want to we want to copy and paste this. So we go to Edit Copy, Edit Paste. Oops, it didn't work. Let's try Edit Cut Paste. Now sometimes there's a little bit of a quirk here where that doesn't work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open a different version of this here and just show you what I wanted to show you. So let's pretend that this is that same layer. So we'll duplicate that layer, and then what we want to do is we want to name the top layer Focus. The bottom layer we will name Blur. We want to hide the focus layer temporarily, and on the blur layer we'll go to Effects, Focus, Soften, and we'll blur it quite a bit like so. Click on OK. We'll reveal the focus layer again, and we'll click down here in the Layers palette on the mask icon to create a mask. Now a mask is kind of a way to erase without erasing permanently. So we'll want to select black, and we'll want to select Airbrush, and we'll choose Fill. We want to fill that mask with black. What that's going to do is that's going to conceal that whole layer and basically make it invisible. Now if we switch to white and we paint, white has the opposite effect. White brings back the focus or reveals that part of that focus layer. So right here in the middle with the airbrush, we're going to bring back the focus a little bit, like so. If you bring back too much focus and you want to remove focus, go back to black and just paint with black. We'll go ahead and drop all layers again, and we'll create a new layer for signature. If you want to sign your piece, you can. I usually like to use the Scratchboard tool, and I like to sample colors from within the piece so it still matches. And sign your piece, and then you will want to save this as, save your original copy as a RIF, and then save a copy by doing Save As. And you could save this as a TIFF for printing, or you could make it smaller and save it as a PNG or a JPEG for posting on the web. And if you want to share this, you can feel free to share this on my Facebook page. So I think that brings me to the end of my demonstration. If there are any more questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Yes, I have a few stragglers here, but you did a tremendous job because I don't have a whole ton of questions, which means that you were very thorough, and people have really enjoyed this. So there's a lot of really nice comments in the questions panel here. So let's see. We've got, and I know there's a shortcut key to turn on clone color, but I don't remember what it is. Do you know what that is?
I don't know what the shortcut is, but over here in the color picker, there's this little icon. It's going to look different in Painter X3 and Painter 12, but basically you click on this and that'll turn on your clone color.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a shortcut for it.
There is. I just can't remember. So I'll have to look that one up and get back to you on that, because also if you have the temporal color palette open, it doesn't have the clone color option, but using that shortcut will work for no matter what color palette you're using. So I'll figure that out. Mm-hmm. And what model of this Cintiq are you using?
It is the Cintiq 24 non-touch version.
Okay. And then there was just a question for you. Someone designs book covers, and she was wondering if you happen to have any tutorials on your YouTube channel that would specifically cover that topic.
I don't, but I will add it to my list for future videos.
Okay, fantastic. And then one last question. Oh my gosh, fast and furious. People are just saying thank you, excellent, amazing job, Aaron. I just want you to know this. People are very, very happy. Okay, so the last question is there any way to work on all of the layers without dropping them?
Yes, you don't necessarily have to drop the layers. The reason why I drop the layers is because I want to simplify things. I mean, like I said before, eventually you're going to have only one layer, and the layers are only necessary and essential while you need them. Once they're not useful to you anymore, it doesn't really make sense to have them there unless you're going to change something or you're worried about messing something up. Sorry, this thing keeps popping up. Somebody did ask a question too that I forgot to address. They were asking about how to adhere to a workflow. They asked this yesterday before the webinar. The most important thing is to keep track of your layers and name your layers, because if you don't name your layers, you're never going to be able to keep track of what's going on if you're using a lot of layers. I also merge the layers together because it makes them easier to blend together, and there might also be times where there's an effect or something that I want to apply to the whole image, like this blur effect that I did. That would have been impossible to do had I had all the layers still present there. I'd have to blur each layer separately, and that would be kind of a pain.
Okay, and I lied because there was one other question that came through, and I know towards the end there you had the glitch where you couldn't copy and paste. Yeah. I have had that issue specifically when presenting online, but I don't know, is there a resolution for that? Let's say that you didn't have a backup file like you did. What would you do in that case?
All you have to do is close Painter and open it again, and it'll work.
Okay.
I didn't want to risk messing anything up.
Right.
For the webinar, so
okay.
I didn't do that. But yeah, that's super easy to fix. You just close Painter and open it, and it's fine. It happens in other programs too, so it's kind of a quirk.
Okay. Yeah. When every program has its quirks, and I don't want to skim over it because I like everybody to know how to fix things when stuff like that happens. So it looks like that's it for the questions, and they're still saying thanks very much. And
thank you thanks everybody for joining. I really appreciate it.